Creating a sequel to an RPG isn't something that should be done for the sake of it. No matter how popular or lucrative something is, it's important to find the potential for a story. If you don't have a story to tell, the whole effort is going to fall apart or simply feel hollow. Not every story has to carry incredibly deep messages or themes, but they do need a heart and a soul. Fun and interesting characters are a great start, but in order for these characters to achieve that, they need to be part of an intricate world. A world worth exploring. Final Fantasy IX's World of Gaia, for example, has a lot of potential for new stories and characters to tell them with. While I believe that Final Fantasy IX doesn't need a sequel, I do believe that revisiting the setting to do something new in a familiar land is a perfectly valid idea for a game. From my perspective, a sequel to Final Fantasy IX would benefit from obviously being set in the same world of Gaia following the events of the first game, but should also be focused around an entirely new cast of characters. Some of these characters could have ties to the original cast, perhaps leading to some brief cameos from returning heroes, but I think keeping them as distant and mythic as possible would be very important. Not only would it avoid any potential inconsistencies, it would retain their status as powerful warriors. The less you see someone doing, the more legendary they seem as a result. Remember how in the early stages of Final Fantasy VII, you don't even see Sephiroth in person. Yet you constantly hear about him, how powerful he was, and how nobody could hope to compare to him. It's kinda like that. That sort of build-up is great for conveying the strength of a character, and for a cast that saved the world from the very incarnation of death itself, that makes complete sense. This approach also means that more of the overall focus can be put on the new characters, who would doubtlessly have more room for development than most of the original cast. I say most because there are a couple of exceptions to that. Amarant, for instance, should certainly play a larger role in this story, perhaps as a mentor to one of the new characters, because he didn't have much of an opportunity to have his character fully explored in the original game. I also think including Aiko more would be a good touch. We could get to see how she's grown over the years and how her perspective has matured as a result of her adventures with Zidane and the gang. For other members of the original cast, however, they should definitely be kept to references or brief, subtle cameos. Imagine one of those meant-to-lose fights akin to the first battle with Beatrix, where this new party is entirely outmatched. Perhaps they're fighting something out of their league, like a Grand Dragon. Before the party is properly wiped out, we're given a cutscene of a dragoon's spear striking the dragon like thunder, followed by a shot of Freya's silhouette perched on a nearby cliff. Glimpses like these would not only emphasize the capabilities of these returning characters, but reinforce their heroic status even further. This also brings us to the idea of new characters in the setting of Gaia. Probably the most exciting thing about a potential sequel to Final Fantasy IX is the fact that there are so many different directions they could take the cast for this one. For the sake of example, here are some general concepts I threw together. A young recruit of the Knights of Pluto seeking to elevate his faction's status out of the shadow of the Alexandrian army, who comes to understand the importance of duty over merely seeking status. The beginning of the game would see him embarking on various antics to gain the approval of Queen Garnet, and by learning and growing over the course of the game, he would embrace the value of cooperation over competition, place honor above status, and in doing so, become a true knight. The female lead could fill the role of thief for this game, perhaps hailing from Trino given its nature as a city of pickpockets and nobles. Full of ambition and the burning desire to work her way up from rags to riches, she sets her sight on the kingdom of Alexandria in her quest to rob the world blind. After stealing from the aforementioned knight, forcing him to pursue her and ultimately joining the party, she steadily opens up to the idea of relying on others instead of solely herself, and comes to find a family in the people around her, something she was seeking the whole time. Her quest for riches doesn't see her find wealth, but it does lead her to discover happiness that money can't buy. This is also the perfect opportunity to finally reintroduce the idea of a Moogle party member. It would be helpful for this new party to include someone familiar with the history and lore of the world, and I can think of none more appropriate than the legendary Moogle Stiltskin. I don't know how he'd fight yet, I'm still working on that. Stiltskin joining the party would give the cast a window into past events, and he would even be familiar with returning characters. The Moogles are already such a large part of the world that it would be simple to build a solid motivation for him to join the party. And aside from that, he's an experienced explorer and merchant, making him an asset to the team outside of combat. I just really want a Moogle in there if I'm being honest. As for other characters who were present in the original game but didn't get a chance to join the party, even temporarily, I think a number of fans would want to see Sir Fradley make a return, and he's actually in a great position to do so. He could be travelling the world embarking on adventures like he once did in an effort to regain his memory. Said memory loss would also justify a previously experienced character being on par with the rest of the party in terms of power. Of course, these are simply all ideas I came up with on the spot. A small team of writers could find almost no end to the amount of characters that could be tied into such a vast world and weave them into a greater plot. Now let's take a look at the antagonistic force of the story. There are actually a number of options available here. While there is the potential for Necron to suddenly return as he ominously hinted at, that might not be the best route to go for. It would only serve to undo the efforts of the original characters and make the conclusion to their story a lot less meaningful. Of course, there's always the potential for a new villainous faction to be introduced. They could be a foreign nation led by a corrupt leader, a collective of corrupt knights pursuing power, or even a band of genomes who consider themselves the greatest form of life on Gaia. It's important to remember that Queen Bran carried out countless terrible deeds in the later stages of her rule, leaving Alexandria with a lot of potential enemies that we simply haven't seen yet. It wouldn't be out of the question to assume some number of victims might seek revenge, or even build an army of their own to achieve it. Given the importance of Hades in the original game as the intended final boss before Necron took his place, he could get his turn in this game and play a greater role in the schemes of whichever villains did ultimately oppose the new heroes. Then, there's the mystery of Ozma. We can presume for the sake of simplicity that the party of the original game defeated it, but even to this day, we don't know the exact circumstances behind it. It's safe to assume Ozma was at one point an Eidolon, given it's found in the Eidolon cave, and since the nature of Eidolons in Final Fantasy IX means their true appearance is destroyed should they be forgotten, it would make sense that this indistinct swirling mass of energy is a victim of this fate. But we don't know for certain. It could simply be this weird eldritch abomination whose real form can't even be perceived by the party. Then there's the fact that Ozma is described as not of this world and has a weird UFO-like nature. Its name is quite possibly inspired by Project Ozma, a real-world experiment that was an early attempt to find extraterrestrial life. Now, I'm not saying we're dealing with aliens here, but could you imagine? Whatever the case, the ambiguous nature of Ozma is an unsettling anomaly that can easily be built upon and explored further, and who better to pursue the pieces of this puzzle than the young summoner Aiko? Her role in this new story would see her leave her new home in Lindblum to investigate the potential for other beings like Ozma, all while shedding light on its roots and potentially unraveling a new sinister plot. Given that the world of Gaia would have been in a state of relative peace for a number of years at this point, along with the fact that inventors and engineers are numerous, technology has likely advanced to some degree. Considering there were traces of steampunk in the original game's storybook fantasy aesthetic, that trait could subtly become a touch more evident in the setting and the characters themselves, with a focus on what such advancements have brought about. Perhaps the aforementioned thief could make use of bombs, or even fight using her dagger and a flintlock pistol in tandem. Maybe the knight wields a portable crossbow as a backup weapon, or if we really want to emphasize the steampunk element, his shield could be fitted with a gear mechanism that houses a grappling hook, intended to allow him to scale walls with ease. The sky is the limit with this stuff, so long as anything new remained true to the charming, colourful aesthetic of the original game without pushing too far into the realms of science fiction. Obviously, there are a number of changes to the world that would be likely to have taken place in the gap between games. Places like Burmecia and Lindblum would be rebuilt. The ice caverns may have melted, possibly revealing hidden caverns and the like. And in regards to new locations, perhaps we could get a good look at some sort of bounty hunter hideout to get some deeper insight into how their society and business works. The introduction of genomes has likely had some impact upon the world. Have they been accepted by all, or is there some element of fear and apprehension surrounding their presence? Have they been welcomed into villages, or have they been forced to build their own? And let's not forget the Black Mages. Given their limited lifespans, it's possible there are very few Black Mages remaining, if any. That said, the ending of the original game insinuates that Vivi perhaps found a way to create more, and these new black mages could even possess longer lifespans. It would make sense for them to have created new villages and branched out into the world, and perhaps in one of these villages, if the player explores, they can come upon a humble monument presenting a familiar oak staff, dedicated to a black mage whose memories became a part of the sky. When it comes to the soundtrack, while I want to say it's gotta be Uematsu, the guy deserves a break, man. And similarly, newer composers deserve a spot in the limelight too. Yoko Shimomura absolutely knocked it out of the park with her work on the Kingdom Hearts series and Final Fantasy XV. And while I believe the music works brilliantly there, I don't know if it'd be able to escape the Kingdom Heartsy vibe that her themes are so synonymous with. Final Fantasy IX had a very distinctly adventurous soundtrack. Sometimes its themes would rely on exactly the orchestral instruments one would expect of the setting, and other times it would revel in all sorts of unique sounds and different approaches to create an almost ethereal atmosphere. On the one hand, you have probably the most cozy music I have ever heard in the theme for the village of Dali, and on the other, you have one of the most nightmarish final boss themes in the series, starting out with the groans and cries of the damned before diving into funky otherworldly synths. The game flirts with so many different musical styles. Players go from dueling to the sound of a flamenco guitar to some ragtime piano and trino and a ukulele chocobo theme. It almost feels like a tribute to music itself. The composer for the sequel should preferably be someone who isn't afraid to dive into this wildly varied approach. And in my opinion, a great choice would be Masayoshi Soken, who has been absolutely killing it with his music for Final Fantasy XIV. But honestly, even better would be Naoshi Mizuta, the composer for Final Fantasy XI. I only had the chance to play 11 for a short while, but even then, the soundtrack had such an impact on me, I'll gladly give it a listen today. I actually listened to the Gustaberg theme to relax while working on this very video. There's something about Mizuta's work that genuinely captures the spirit of Final Fantasy, especially that of early 3D titles, which makes sense given that he takes influence from Uematsu himself. In fact, having both composers contribute their own themes to the soundtrack would be great. A strength of Soken's is definitely his pop and battle themes, while Mizuta can craft an atmosphere like no other. As for the director, we gotta bring my boy Hiroyuki Ito back. Square, I don't know where you're keeping this man, but please go dig him up, dust him off, and have him direct another game. For those who don't know, Ito directed Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy IX, and Final Fantasy XII. That's one hell of a track record. Not only that, he created the ATB system. If anyone understands how to go about a sequel to this game, it's this guy. Unfortunately, not having Sakaguchi there to handle the writing sucks. But games like Final Fantasy X especially prove you can have an amazing story worthy of the series even without him. Now, something else to consider is the fact that this game would probably be voiced. And given that the Final Fantasy VII Remake seems to have ditched the Dissidia voice actors, it's anyone's guess as to who would end up providing the voices for new and returning characters alike. This side of things is a bit harder to hypothesize on, because there's no telling who could ultimately be the perfect fit for a character's voice. We can't even say with much certainty who should voice Zidane, other than, me. That would honestly be a dream come true. Whatever the case, I do believe that opting for newer voice actors is probably the way to go. Hell, I've never heard of Cloud's voice actor in the remake, but he's doing a great job so far. More and more I find myself blown away by how good relatively unknown voice actors can be, and I think that those people should be given the chance to show what they can do in massive games like these. While I think that the 7 Remake's combat is shaping up to be great because it addresses everything I didn't like about 15's combat, I feel as though fans would likely find a return to the classic ATB system to be a breath of fresh air after being without it for so long. We haven't had a proper turn-based game in the main series since Final Fantasy X. That was almost 2 decades ago. Games like Persona 5 prove that there's still very much a demand for the more strategic approach of turn-based combat. But I believe that instead of attempting to reinvent the wheel this time around, Square would be wise to play it safe here for 2 reasons. First, we've had a number of attempts now of trying to sort of remix the standard ATB system in Final Fantasy games, and from my experience at least, it doesn't usually work all that well. Instead, they could perhaps develop a new mechanic within the game that alters the way abilities are handled. 7 had materia, 8 had the junction system, 9 had equipment abilities, 10 had the sphere grid, and so on. They could either invent something new, or simply reuse the equipment ability system of 9 because it was just so satisfying and fun. The second reason I believe doubling down on the standard formula is a solid plan here is because Final Fantasy IX itself was already sort of a tribute to the roots of the series, celebrating all of the classic formulas that made the series up until that point great. Sticking to a tried and true approach would serve to carry these ideals from the original game into the sequel. Final Fantasy IX made use of a number of themes, most prominently the inevitability of death and the immeasurable value of life. I think that a sequel would benefit from exploring entirely new ones that build upon similar ideas, and these could stem from the relative state of peace the setting would likely begin in. Themes like the inherent need for direction and purpose. How do you make an impact in a world that doesn't strictly need one? How is it that we find not just a place to belong, but the perspective to match? In understanding the value of our lives, how do we decide to go about living them? Should we place worth upon the ideals of those around us, or simply what makes us happy? This is an interesting theme to cover because it's something so few people actually get right the first time around. We've all had dreams we simply couldn't reach. Oftentimes people will fail spectacularly at something they put all their effort into. The key to this theme is how that failure comes to define the characters in question. What do they do when their purpose is taken from them? How do they come to rebuild their volition and use their failure to propel themselves towards something new? The original game was very much a story about finding a place to belong and the people to share it with. I believe a sequel should be about finding yourself. It should be about coming to understand not only your own capabilities, but also your limits and how that lines up with what you want from life, exploring exactly who you are and coming to terms with that. Once the heroes properly understand and accept themselves, that's when they can truly find a place to call home. That's all for this video, but now that I've crafted my blueprint for this sequel, what would you do differently? Are there other games you would love to see a sequel to? I'd like to hear your thoughts, so go ahead and let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video and wouldn't mind supporting my channel, then please take a look at my Patreon linked in the description. Thanks for watching, I'll catch you next time.